What's the Worst Sword by Skallagrim.
Yesterday, I had the audacity to go outside without sunscreen on a 15 degrees Celsius overcast day. But then the clouds parted and the death ray hit my exposed flesh.
Yeah.
That's why I look like a pomegranate now.
Fair enough.
Anyway, as amusing as it may be to venture onto the irradiated battlefield that is debating which is the best sword ever, what about the opposite?
What's
the worst sword? Well, it depends. And it's
I mean, can we technically say this Zweihander? Hear me out. Because don't you use a Zweihander more like a polearm than a sword? It's just a polearm that's shaped like a sword. So technically, if we're talking about swords or things that look like swords being used like swords, you didn't necessarily use a Zweihander in actuality like you did Giant Dad in Dark Souls 1. So, I'm actually curious where this is going to go. I think this is going to be an amazing video.
Stupid vague question anyway. Thanks for watching.
Got him. The cut. No, that was it, everybody. Good time.
For real though, it's a complex question, obviously, with many possible answers. So let's explore a few. The classic answer is the Spadroon, or specifically the 1796 model, which has had some complaints leveled against it, including such trivial criticism as expressed by General Cavalier Mercer, who said nothing could be more useless or ridiculous than the old infantry regulation. It was good for neither cut nor thrust. It was a perfect encumbrance.
Really?
Tell us how you really feel. Yeah. It's typically criticized for its foldable guard that may fail when you try to block an enemy strike. It's sometimes said to be too light, or it doesn't cut well, it doesn't thrust well either. The ergonomics are off, etc., etc. This has been discussed in great detail. And in fact, this is not a sword that I'm familiar with. I've never handled one. I'm going to refer you to Matt Easton, for example, and other channels that have discussed this, linked in the description below.
Honestly, I'm going to have to ask SCA about that, because there's a lot... The amount of people that I find that just know really cool stuff, or are like specialists in history, or specific time periods in history, like, is oddly high in SCA. But then again, it's not so odd now that I think about it, right? I mean, I'm sure someone in SCA could actually like write me an entire dissertation on this. I've personally never heard of it, but I mean, it also depends on the time period this is, what the intent of the sword was. Sword can be awful for cut and thrust, right? But is it necessarily made to do that, right? Are you going to necessarily judge a kukri on its ability to stab something? Or are you going to judge a kukri on its ability to hack at something? So I think the supplemental material, which really, honestly, like mad props to Skallagrim here for citing outside sources, right? As somebody who has been overly critical of misinformation, somebody who has, you know, just like, look, cite your things, even in what I do, right? Reactions, right? Look in the description right now, right? Pause the video, look down right now. You will see Skallagrim's channel and the original video linked down there for your convenience, right? Citing sources is something that is just so lost anymore. And I love that instead of just relegating this as to a footnote in the description section, Skallagrim's just like, hey, yeah, this is where you can go. This is what you can watch. Go check it out in the video so you don't miss that context should you choose to go and watch that. I think that's really interesting. I love that he does it.
Sure, the 1796 had some flaws that were improved in later model Spadroons, and it's important to keep in mind that not all Spadroons were made the same. Right. So some were pretty good swords, others maybe not so much. In that time frame, there were complaints about other swords as well, like for example the French sabre briquet or briquette saber, and others as well. Sometimes the soldiers complained about them not cutting well enough, other times they complained about them being too clunky, dubbing them the old wrist breaker, things like that. Either way, here's something important to keep in mind. As history progresses, more and more people get the opportunity to express themselves, and more of that is preserved to us. At first, it's just an elite class of clergy or scholars, and more, the middle class gets access to writing and the means to do it. Eventually, even commoners get to express themselves.
So here's the thing about this that frustrates me, and he's absolutely on with this. Like, I agree with everything he's saying, and historically, we can look this up and cite this, right? Teachers nowadays are so underappreciated. They are so absolutely just dogged on, And I think that that's absolutely asinine. I think that's incredibly unfair. As somebody that goes to SCA and has teachers in what I do, right? Not like their actual, like their job is actually they like teach students, like they teach classes, they teach kids, right? Oh my God, it is insane what some of these parents will try to just be like, well, my little Timmy wants more extra credit. Like, ma'am, your little Timmy, like, didn't want to do any extra credit. They've turned in everything late. I've done everything I physically, and then they can still end up on the short end of that stick. Being a teacher's hard. Scholars and just clergymen, like he's saying, used to be like really highly prized positions in society. And now everybody thinks it's okay to just dog on teachers. It's just a weird like pain point I have, and I love when people like talk about this because I can point out how bad teachers have it anymore. Like, it's not okay. Being literate and being able to teach others is an asset. It is huge. And we anymore really just prize illiteracy and stupidity.
Soldiers, more complaints are preserved, and complaints by the grunts who have the boots on the ground. If you ask current day soldiers what's the worst rifle or handgun, you'll get different answers.
All right. Well, what do you got? What do you got, chat? What do you got? Military, calling upon you. Marine Corps, Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, Cav Scouts, everybody. What's the worst rifle? You're welcome. You're welcome for the comment section on that. Thank you, Skallagrim.
If you run with the first one you get, that might be a little bit inaccurate, or at least only one piece of the puzzle, shall we say. So on the one hand, you have the tendency that as time goes on, there are more and more complaints, but at the same time, improvements have been made.
Exactly.
If you were to tell me that a 1796 Spadroon is objectively worse in every way than a Bronze Age sword, I would have to say you might be taking the wrong medication. Don't get me wrong, bronze is a beautiful material, and this leaf blade is quite a nice shape.
I do love leaf blades.
Effective too for a sword of this size, but there's a lot left to be desired here. I mean, this grip here is very simple.
Pretty bad.
There's no guard. It's got this big pommel that locks your hand into a particular position. And, well, it's bronze. You know, as pretty as it is, it can't compete with steel. No. And even when we're looking at bronze, early bronze blades would have been worse than later ones because they kept improving things. They kept altering the alloy. And in fact, a late Bronze Age sword might have been better than an early iron sword.
Right.
Because they had to go through the same process of figuring out how to best do this.
Yeah.
Now, there were still some advantages, even to early iron. For example, you only need one ore, whereas here you need two different resources that oftentimes...
Copper and Tin, thank you, RuneScape, for teaching me about that. Dear God, I've played too many hours mining in RuneScape. I don't want to talk about it. I'm not okay.
had to come from different geographical areas. The simplest answer to which was the worst sword in history would be the first one. I've made a video about the oldest known swords, which were made of copper, and the way they were shaped makes me think they weren't even intended to be used. The handles were weirdly flat and wide and not ergonomic whatsoever.
Maybe ceremonial?
But either way, the first usable sword that was intended for use probably didn't look a whole lot different. Another interesting example to point to is Danish flint swords. Scandinavia was lagging behind a little bit, while the rest of Europe, and especially the Middle East, had already entered the Bronze Age and was cranking out bronze blades. They were still in the Neolithic, basically. And they imitated some of the bronze blades that circulated through trade and tried to make them of flint. This is a pretty bad sword, even compared to a bronze blade.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this may very well have been just a prestige item, something to trade, or an art piece, essentially.
I'd be very curious to the integrity of flint. I don't know enough about flint as a material. Obviously, you have the flint and steel make a spark, right? I don't know enough about it as a material, though. I mean, even then, when you come down to steel and stuff like that, I mean, you start discussing metallurgy, and in regards to, why certain blades in certain time frames, say in like Japan, are a better quality than other times, right? And you start getting the metallurgy, availability of materials, raw resources, how they forge the blade itself, right? I mean, across the world, there's a number of factors that go into this. I personally didn't even ever hear of this, which is why I love history too. Love things like this is something that someone would bring to an SCA event and be like, yeah, no, this is a thing. Yeah, Scandinavia did this once upon a time. Like, what? Yeah, it's not period, but I mean, yeah, this is what they did. Like, I love this. This is great.
It's not like they didn't make art back then.
No, absolutely not.
Obviously.
They did.
And in fact, it takes a lot of skill to produce such precise pieces of flint. So as a sword, it would be terrible, but it's still very impressive craftsmanship. As sword development progresses, we eventually reach a highly developed type.
Oh, is he going to say the rapier? Oh, whoops. Sorry, chat.
Rapier.
God. Yep. Oh, me and the rapier go round and round. I show up with a longsword to our rapier combat. The rapier is a glorified shiv. And I say that in the most loving way that I can. It is a glorified shiv. I can already hear the comments section. I can already hear the keyboards. We refer in our chapter. We have a couple of us that do refer to them as just glorified shivs because it's not wrong. But actually, like, you take a look at the sword designs before, right? So like let's go back a little bit, right? So you can see kind of this more simplistic design. You saw the Bronze Age design. Or this is the Flint, right? You go back, you see early copper, right? Bronze Age design too, right? How it's got it's got no pommel, it has the big pommel. It's got no handguard, no keons, nothing like that. Your hand protection is going to be minimal. But as you go on through history, right? You go on through history and you reach to the evolution of the rapier, right? I'm going to get back to it. Right, we're going from kind of these designs, and even in the background, you can kind of see some of those long swords, broadswords, etc.
Be terrible, but it's still very impressive craftsmanship. As sword development progresses, we eventually reach a highly developed type, rapier.
Now look at the proportions on this. Look how thin that blade is. Look, we now have hand protection. We now even have these keons here. We have a much smaller pommel. You can see the evolution of the sword, at least this variant of the sword, from going back to the Bronze Age, going back to the Iron Age, going back and seeing some of those flint pieces, right? There are reasonings and adaptations to why the rapier developed in the way that it did. And it's fascinating to watch these evolutions. I mean, as much as I talk smack about the rapier, I mean, a good rapier fencer ? A good rapier user is still a good rapier user. And if they know what they're doing, I mean, they're going to absolutely just trounce me in a duel. They're going to trounce me in a tournament, right? Like, don't underestimate the rapier users. Maybe a glorified shiv with with little hand guards, right? But man, they are precise.
Which has plenty going for it. Complex hilt. There's a lot of features that have been added slowly over time. And many do consider this to be one of the best swords. But
reasonably,
back in history, some people consider this one of the worst. Lately, I've been practicing more with a basket hilt broadsword. And I can see more and more
honestly sexy.
Yes, George Silver was onto something. The long, narrow blade of a rapier is at a disadvantage against this. You wouldn't think so. You would think, oh, this superior reach and blah, blah, blah. But
well, so at that point, when you're fighting something like that, I mean, you're putting skill points in different territory, or different. You're allocating them differently, right? So you have a more broader, potentially shorter blade, right? It's more stout, right? And yeah, you can have some more strength behind it. It's got more weight behind it. You can do different things with the leverage, right? So if you come out with putting your blade out trying to meet them, right? It's entirely possible that a rapier user could cavazione and just go in, right? Well, I'm just going to move my plane of steel laterally across my body to block that, right? And this is where you get into the entire dance and study of sword fighting, right? And you have many teachers, from Japan, you have, people like Musashi, you have people like Godinho, you have people like Capoferro, you have so many schools of thought on sword fighting, dueling, etc., that it's very interesting to see how some of this evolves. And I think it more comes down to the user. I'm not gonna talk negatively about either of these blades. I think each of them have their own strengths, and if someone prefers the more stout, that's fine. That being said, if somebody looks at both and goes, "No, I'll take the rapier," and they show up to combat, and they got a certain look about them, I'm like, okay, you're about to trounce me, right? It's just what everyone's familiar with. It's what you feel comfortable with. There are people that would rather use a rapier. There's people like me that would rather use a longsword, even in rapier format, because it's something that I want to do. I'm, yes, at a disadvantage, especially in dual wielding situations, because I have 1.1 sword to 2 swords, right? Logistically, there is more sword that they have to my sword, right? The amount is double. So it comes down to stuff like that. And you have things like Cavazziones, you have things going into specific guards and stuff like that. I do think that as stout as that blade is, honestly, that's actually kind of hot. I would really love to fight one of those.
When sparring with a rapier against a broadsword, I found that, yes, it was quite difficult to deliver a safe thrust in particular, because normally against another rapier, you rely on getting a bind and winning the bind and then thrusting while covered. Here, the broadsword can just deny you and can just take over the bind and just not allow you to be on point in a safe way.
I'm going to send this to my SCA chapter, and in the most loving way possible, I'm going to be like, Lamau, look at this rapier slander. And I'm not talking smack about Skallagrim, I promise. Skallagrim, I'm loving you for this because you're giving me conversation points to talk with SCA about. Because generally, when I've done rapier combat, at least what we do, right? I mean, we do our Cavazziones, we'll do... for those that don't know what a Cavazione is, think like you're taking your swords are touching each other at the tips, right? One's on one side, one's on the other side, and you take your sword, you dip it down, and then it appears on the other side of it. You kind of like dip it in a U or a V under their sword really quickly to end up on the other side of it, and thus you can Cavazione, and then you can shift your wrist from right out in front of you to knuckles down, right, moving your wrist to the right, and then you have the strong of your blade blocking their blade, but then they can counter Cavazione. There's a number of plays that goes into that. In terms of binds, personally, I haven't seen in what I do a lot, but then again, I'm also not a fencing champion. I'm also not a rapier champion in SCA, so I do open you SCA folks. Absolutely. Hi. Good to see you. I hope to be making some big events pretty soon. I do play in Arnhold out in Idaho, if that is where you're at or know where that is. You probably know who heads that, probably know some of the legit people out there, especially some of them being white scarf holders for a number of years. We actually have a Don out here. They did discontinue the Don title, the Spanish Don, D-O-N. They did discontinue that title some years ago, from my understanding. We do have one out here. And I open up to you, what is your experience with rapier? Do you think that this is on point? Do you think that this is not on point? I'm very curious as to your feedback, especially as somebody who uses longsword to fight rapiers. This video is amazing. I love reacting to things like these. I think that a lot of people, this kind of goes over their head, but I'm so giddy when I actually get to talk about combat.
Satirical video about the superiority of the small sword, where the snobbish gentleman I portrayed talked about how the small sword is the refined version of the rapier, more advanced. Yeah. Even though it was a joke, in some ways you can argue that. For civilian self-defense and dueling, it's just so much easier to carry.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have some of the disadvantages that such a long blade has, which is that leverage can be used against you and you might get stuck more easily. There are also situations in which the small sword is arguably the worst thing you could possibly have.
Right.
I mean, if you're fighting an armored knight with a poleaxe, yes, you could say the small sword could be used to thrust into the gaps of the armor, but good luck getting there. And then, of course, rather than looking for the word.
I mean, especially if somebody that wears armor, sometimes there just is not... I put on my armor and my cloak. I actually have footage of it I have to edit together. It's been a past week for me. And Buddy looks at me and goes, I've never quite understood how the +1 to, like, intimidate modifiers really worked in D&D. But seeing you put on that armor, like, yeah, that's a +1 to intimidation right there. Like, I'm not conditioned for my armor. I'm really not. I got to get some leather, got to get some chainmail. I got to work up to steel again. Not that I was really conditioned to it in the first place, because, God, it's heavy, but I love it so much. Like, Yeah, it really just depends on the situation. And that's why throughout history, we will see a change in weapons, or we'll see a change in armor, and we'll see a change in things, even in the firearm side of things, right? Did we not have, the FAL, right? FN FAL, or battle rifles back after, World War II, like during the Cold War, stuff like that. And now we've moved more to, we had the M1 Garand back in World War I, and then we started moving into, what was the MP40 that Germany had, where it was, smaller SMG 9mm kind of things, right? And then, now we have, our service pistols, military issued pistols, are going to be something like 9mm versus something like 45 ACP or 50 AE, right? Well, why is that? Well, I mean, the gap between 9mm and 45 ACP has closed so much that it's just, you would rather have more pew-pew per magazine, right? And that's actually, as far as I'm aware, what the modern U.S. military does use. They want to have more bullets per bullet, right? And if that's what you're going with, that suddenly makes sense why we don't have, Marines walking around with gold Desert Eagles, right? Or we don't have army personnel, right, walking around with 1911s as standard issue, right? As far as I'm aware, most of that is going to be 9mm. So it's just trends and hopping on that. And in response to that, you have more heavily armored stuff. Okay, cool. Maybe something like a rapier is going to come in, right? You have less armored stuff. Okay, maybe something more like a hacking thing, like a kukri, or some sort of cleaver-like weapon, or a longsword might be more useful, right? Something maybe to get in between chain links, right? There's so much that goes into this, and it is an entire study that I am unqualified to really talk about. Like, it's so fascinating to me, though.
First type of sword, you could point at particularly poorly made examples. There's some very crudely made Dusaks, for example.
Cautions, yeah.
Probably forged in a few hours by some village blacksmith, lacking even the most basic handle. There's no evidence that handle scales or some kind of organic grip was attached. Maybe it was wrapped in leather or cloth, but there's even a painting depicting one of these with just bare metal, not even a wrap. That's pretty rough, if you ask me. So obviously, it's the same problem as when trying to decide which is the best sword. Best for what, or worst for what? Which situation, what are we talking about, etc. But I feel like there is a pretty fair answer to what's the worst sword.
I'm ready for this.
I found something that, if you're a sword connoisseur, will sear your eyeballs and put your brain into a vice.
I'm ready. I hate this.
I hope the person who made it will never see this video, but
I really actually kind of hate this, though. I actually have had some issues with Final Fantasy XIV sword designs. What I'm specifically against is if you look below what the crossguard, quote unquote, you look below the keons, and you before the blade, that looks god awful to me. That hurts. I hate this. Like, objectively, I hate this. It'd be a cool showpiece, I guess, but I feel like it's really brittle where the grip connects to the blade. No, you know what, Skallagrim? I was coming into this. I'm like, oh, this will be a pretty subjective thing. I think you have just objectively found the most god-awful sword I've ever seen. And I love you for it. Thank you, Skallagrim. Thank you for cursing me with this knowledge. Jesus Christ.
Can't sugarcoat it. I've never seen a blade
it's bad.
Welded on like this. It's a sight to behold.
It is a blade of all time.
It's a bit silly in some ways to count modern wall hangers.
Yeah.
Because they aren't even intended for combat. But
that's not fair.
If you just want to answer the question, what's the worst sword ever made? Well, we've got plenty to choose from. And if you want to include fictional sword-like objects, the abomination from the Sword and the Sorcerer can't be beaten.
That looks
so
god-awful.
Postmodern wall hangers would be my answer. Or if you want to go a little further back to make it historical, the Victorians made wall hangers. If you don't want to count that, then the first sword ever made would be the worst, for obvious reasons. It might be an overly simplistic answer, but in my book, those are indeed way worse than even the 1796 Spadroon. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks.
I think he brought a lot to this. I think if you look at this video, it really does a lot. Like, it covers so many counter arguments. What about this French sword? Well, I mean, it depends on who made it, depends on the era, depends if it was a ramshackle job, depends if it was good or not, right? There's a number of things that you look at, and I think you look at and go, no, that makes sense. And he brings like, oh, well, you can just say, what about those wall hangers, right? What about those things you can just get from a department store and they're meant to just be display only? Yeah. That too, you could do that. Alternatively, what about the first sword ever made? Well, that's a cop-out answer. Everything's not good for its first thing. Well, have you considered that, some people say the rapier is bad. I think it's bad in these aspects. It has these strengths, but I mean, if you're looking for kind of an answer for this, right? I think that there's so much here, and I actually like it. And honestly, like, if we're looking at it, when you encounter a situation like this, right? When you encounter an argument or someone poses a question, what's the worst Yu-Gi-Oh card? What's the worst Pokemon? Mate, what are you looking for from me? Are you looking for playability, competitivity? Like, are you looking for, like, it's a brick to read that's just word vomit? Like, what are you wanting from me? Oh, well, no, I want the worst. Okay, but do you understand how subjective a question that is? Now, if we're saying, well, what is the worst sword that has performed historically, or what is the worst sword in the sense that it had the shortest time period in which it really saw use, right? Okay, now we can talk. Okay, well, let's talk about this. Well, we had some of these falchion kind of things, and we have just throwing falchion under the bus here as a hypothetical, right? We have some of these falchion kind of things right here, and they only saw service between this year and this year, and from historical accounts, we really don't have people really using this. They'd rather use gardening implements like scythes, or they'd rather use things like bow doors, right? Okay, so you could point to that being the worst, right? That's fair. We have brought the requisite information to the argument. So I think, honestly, for a generalized what is the worst sword ever, I think this video not only answered the question, but also provided more. I think that this was honestly great. So Skallagrim, thank you for making this video. This was great. This answered this from a number of perspectives, and continue just putting out the great work that you do. This is very interesting for me as someone that does SCA, from somebody that has interest in combat and swords, and just really kind of look at it and kind of give my thoughts on it and kind of react to it and kind of just like, hey, no, this is kind of cool. It's kind of rose hard, right? So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Down in the description, you will absolutely see the Skallagrim original video, as well as the link down below. Let me know what you think, all that fun stuff. And if you're an SCA, let me know where you play. And hopefully I can get out some events soon. Thank you everyone for watching. I definitely do appreciate it. See y'all in the next one.